Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you. Erev Shavuos special time. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Capiz Hub, Shalom and Mabuhay from the Philippines. Welcome, Capiz. Great to have you with us. John in Maine. Ella wishing everyone Hag Sameach. Franco in Trieste, Italy. Welcome, everybody. Big daf. Let's get to it. Our page today is 103 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Pick this up near the bottom of page 102b, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 8, which, God willing, we're going to complete today. The sages raised a dilemma before Rabbi Yanai. If a renter says to his landlord, I already gave the rent to you, and the landlord says, I didn't take any payment from you, so upon whom is the burden of proof? And the Gemara clarifies the dilemma. When did the renter make this claim? If it was during his rental period, so we already learned the law in this case, and the sages would not have asked about it. And similarly, if he made the claim after his rental period, we also learned the law in that case as well. How do we learn it? As we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Bechoros, page 49a, a father is obligated to redeem his firstborn son after the son is 30 days old by paying 5 shekels to a priest. This is known as redemption of the firstborn. Hold on. Of the firstborn, okay. And if the father died within 30 days of the birth, then the son has the presumptive status of having been unredeemed, since it would have not been timely to redeem him, within 30 days of the birth. And he keeps that presumptive status until people tell him that he was redeemed. I'm sorry. If the father died within 30 days of the birth, the son has the presumptive status of being unredeemed until he brings a proof that he was redeemed, that he was somehow otherwise redeemed. So if the father died after 30 days, then the son has the presumptive status that he was redeemed until people come and tell him that he was not redeemed and he actually has to take care of this. Now, it is apparent from the Mishnah that a person is presumed not to pay money before he is obligated to pay the money, and he is presumed to have paid the money once he is required to do so. And we can apply this same logic to the paying of the rental fee, right? When does the rent come due? Absent other proof to the contrary, a person is presumed not to have paid the rent before it was due, and a person is presumed to have paid the rent after it was due. Again, this is in the absence of other evidence. So, since we've already learned that, why are the sages raising this dilemma before Rabbi Yanai? And the Gemara explains it was necessary to raise this dilemma in a case where the renter makes his claim that he's already paid the rent, right? And the landlord says he hasn't paid the rent. And this dispute happens on the very day in which the rental period is completed. And so the dilemma is whether a person is apt to pay his debts on the very day on which the period in which to pay them has been completed, or is he not apt to do so? So Rabbi Yochanan said to them, the ones raising the dilemma, in fact, you've also learned the answer to this in a Mishnah that we will encounter on page 111 of this tractate. And that's like this. Like this. Now we're on page 103a. If a hired laborer claims his wages at the proper time, meaning on the day his wages are due, and the employer claims that he already paid the laborer, then the laborer takes an oath that he did not receive his wages, and he gets his wages. And so too, in the case of rent, if the landlord demands payment and the renter claims that he's already paid, the landlord should be able to take an oath and then receive his payment from the renter. So the Gemara explains, generally, one takes an oath to exempt oneself from paying, not to collect. And it is specifically in the case of a hired laborer that the sages imposed an oath upon him due to the fact that the employer is busy with his workers and he might mistakenly think that he paid a particular worker when in fact he had paid a different worker. But here in the case of rent, when there is no such concern, I suppose you could say that that a landlord owns so many buildings, and he thought he is looking for the rent from somebody, but he didn't. But you see, it doesn't quite make sense. It's not the same as an employer who has lots of workers. Even a landlord who has lots of buildings, the rent he has a unique relationship with each renter. And in ancient times, you didn't have landlords who own apartment buildings, right? They were renting individual houses to people. So it's different. So here in the case of rent, where we don't have that concern, the renter is deemed credible that he already paid the rent, provided that he takes an oath, right? And this oath taking is in the absence of witnesses who could testify. When it's your word versus his word, who is going to have the oath imposed upon him? Now, obviously, this idea of taking an oath and either receiving payment or being exempt from making payment only works in a pious society, right? If people just, will lie and swear no to anything, then it wouldn't work. But in this community, in this society that we're talking about, people were not going to willy-nilly lie and take an oath before God that they either had made a payment or that they had not received a payment. Rav Nachman says, in the case of one who rented out a house to another for a 10-year period and had written him an undated document attesting to this fact, the 10-year rental agreement, but it was not a dated agreement, right? And later the landlord said to the renter, well, you have already taken 5 years of your rental period, so the landlord is deemed credible. And the burden of proof is not on the landlord, and the renter cannot use the document to demonstrate that he has a right to rent for 10 more years, because it says it's it's good for 10 years, but it doesn't have a date on it. So Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, if that is so, then if one lent 100 dinars to another person with a promissory note, and later the borrower said to him, I have already paid you half of the loan, so too should he be deemed credible? We know that's not the law. Where there's a partial admission, yes, I borrowed from you, but I already paid back half of what I owe. That's the classic situation where the borrower takes an oath about what he admits, he has a partial admission that yes, he borrowed, but he claims he already paid back half. So he takes an oath to that effect, and then he's only liable to pay back the half that he has not yet paid back, because he swore that he paid the other half. So Ravina said to him, how can you compare these cases of the borrower who swears that he's already paid back half with a renter or a landlord who says you've already used up half the period? Ravina said to him, how can you compare these cases? They are in the case of the loan. The promissory note exists to allow the lender to collect the debt. And if it is so that the borrower repaid part of the debt, the lender should have written that fact on the note itself. And alternatively, he could have written a receipt to enable the borrower to prove he had paid. But here in the case of rent, the landlord could say to the renter, the fact that I wrote the document for your rental of the property was only in order to ensure that you would not be able to establish a presumptive ownership of the property and thereby be able to claim it belongs to you. When somebody is living continuously on a property for 3 years, they can establish a claim of ownership that they actually own that property. This is why the landlord said, no, we have a 10-year rental. And that's why this guy's been living there for more than 3 years, not because he's the owner, but rather because he's renting from me. And that was the purpose of the document. Therefore, the bill cannot be used to prove that the renter has a right to occupy the property, for as many years as were written in the original agreement. Now, obviously, the big mistake was that when they entered into that agreement, they didn't put a date on that agreement. So many of these disputes that the sages are working out is because the parties didn't draw up a proper contract at the outset. And now we're applying Torah and rabbinic law to figure out how we're going to dispose of the case in the absence of a properly negotiated and drafted contract that accounts for all of the details. New subject. Rav Nachman says, a person may borrow another person's utensil in good working order forever, right? So that's actually a legal term. Meaning, if he requests to borrow the utensil, imagine a shovel, if he requests to borrow it, as long as it is in good working order, right? So that's quite a favor that the owner of the shovel is doing. The borrower is saying, may I borrow that shovel as long as it is in good working order? Meaning, can I borrow it forever or until it breaks? That's what he's saying. And apparently, the lender agreed to that. So if he requests to borrow it as long as it is in good working order, then even after returning it to the owner, he may continue to take it and use it indefinitely. And the owner cannot prevent him from doing so because that is what he agreed to. That was the rental period. Forever, as long as it is in good working order. Now, Rav Mari, the son of the daughter of Shmuel, said, and what is only if he perform? And that you can borrow it forever as long as it's in good working order, is only if the borrower performed a kinyan, right? An act of acquisition concerning this right that he can do it forever or as long as it's in good working order with the owner. Otherwise, once he returns the utensil to the owner, he can no longer borrow it again without his consent. And Rav Mari, the son of Rav Ashi, said, and if the utensil breaks, the borrower may no longer keep it, but must return its handle, i.e. the remaining parts, to the owner. And Rava says, in the case of one who says to another, lend me a hoe, in order to dig up this orchard, he may use it only to dig up the particular orchard that he specified. But if he said, lend it to me to dig up an orchard, then he may use it to dig up any one orchard that he desires. And if he said, lend it to me to dig up orchards, then he may use it to dig up all the orchards that he has, however numerous they are. And in all these cases, if he breaks the utensil, he must return its handle, i.e. the remaining parts, to the owner. And Rav Papa says, in the case of one who says to another, lend me this well for me to use to irrigate my fields. And then the walls of the well fell down. So the borrower may not rebuild it and then use it again, as he had specified that he was borrowing that particular well with those walls. If he said, lend me a well, and then its walls fell down, now the borrower may rebuild that well and use it, but he may not take a different well. And if he said, lend me a place in your land for a well, so he may continually dig many different wells in the lender's land until he happens upon a water source that is suitable for his needs. But in order to have this indefinite right, he needs to perform an act of acquisition concerning the right with the owner present. Okay, so now you see over and over and over again, right? And any lawyer will tell you that if parties enter into some kind of a transactional relationship, rent, borrow, etc., it would be good at the outset to spell out as clearly as possible what exactly it is that they're agreeing to. And when they do so, they should be very careful of their language because they might be borrowing or agreeing to lend more than they contemplated, right? And this is why people have lawyers, right? Good line, Danny DeVito and Other People's Money, speaking about lawyers. You know, lawyers are like nuclear weapons. The other side has theirs. You got to have yours. Better get a good one. What can I say? I say that as a recovering lawyer. Long time recovering lawyer. Okay. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Mishnah number 9, here in chapter 8, the final Mishnah of the chapter, and it's a short one. Mishnah 9. In the case of one who rented out a house to another, and then the house fell, the landlord is obligated to provide the renter with another house. If the original house was small, the landlord may not construct a large house as a replacement. Why not? You were renting a small house, it fell down, and the landlord's going to give you a bigger house? Why not? The Gemara will ask the same question. And if the original was large, the landlord may not construct a small house as a replacement. Okay, that's intuitive. If the original one had one room, he may not construct the replacement with 2 rooms. Surprising. And if the original had 2 rooms, he may not construct the replacement with 1. Intuitive. He may not reduce the number of windows nor add to them, except with the agreement of both of them, the landlord and the renter. So what are the circumstances of the Mishnah's case? If it is a case where the landlord said to the renter, I am renting this house to you, once it has fallen, it has gone, and the rental agreement does not obligate the landlord to provide another one, because he said, I'm renting this house to you. Do you see what's coming next? If it is a case where the landlord said to him, I am renting a house to you, without specification, then even if the original house had 1 room, why may the landlord not construct its replacement with 2 rooms? Meaning, if I'm renting a house to you, and we, agreed and you paid, and now this house that I lent to you collapses, I have to rebuild a house. I have to replace the house because I've agreed to rent you a house, right? As opposed to this house. If it's this house and it collapses, the landlord's off the hook. If the landlord agrees to rent a house and the house collapses that the renter is in, the landlord now has to build a house. So now we're going right to the next question. Well, if that's the case, why can't he rebuild a bigger house and give the renter that? Why may the landlord not construct its replacement with 2 rooms? And if the original was small, why may the landlord not construct a large house as a replacement? And Reish Lakish said, the case is where he said to him, the house that I am renting to you, the measurement of its length is such and such, and its width is such and such. Since he did not specify a specific house, he is obligated to provide a replacement, and the replacement must match the specifications of the unspecified house that they agreed to rent. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, what is the purpose of stating this ruling? It is obvious. Rather, when Ravin came, he said to Reish Lakish, he said that Reish Lakish said, the case is where he said, I am renting to you a house like this. So the Gemara persists. Okay, but still, what is the purpose of stating this ruling? It is obvious. And the Gemara answers, no, the ruling is necessary where the house that the landlord spoke of was standing on the bank of a river. Lest you say that what the landlord meant by saying a house like this was that he would provide the renter with a house that stands on the bank of a river. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that if he uses such an expression, it is taken to refer to the dimensions and structure of the house, not the type of location on which it stands. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9 here in chapter 8, and it concludes chapter 8. Now we move on to chapter 9, which is going to be about the laws governing more closely employer-employee relationships and when the wages of an employee are due. 103a, in the beginning of chapter 9, Mishnah number 1. With regard to one who receives a field from another to cultivate, either as a tenant farmer, who in exchange for the right to farm the land gives a set amount of the produce to the owner, or as a sharecropper who cultivates the land and receives a set proportion of the produce, right? In other words, sharecropper, a certain percentage of the produce goes to the owner, a certain percentage goes to the sharecropper. Tenant farmer, he has an absolute amount of produce, numerical amount, not a percentage, that he has to turn over to the owner, and he keeps the rest. And that's tough on a tenant farmer because if he produces nothing, he still owes the rent. Whereas the sharecropper, if he produces nothing, okay, well then any percentage of nothing is nothing. Okay, so regarding these two relationships, in a location where those cultivating the land were accustomed to cut the produce, so this one, the tenant farmer or the sharecropper, must cut it as well. In a location where they were accustomed to uproot the produce, not to cut it with a sickle or a scythe, this one must uproot it as well. If in that location, the other tenant farmers and sharecroppers are accustomed to plow the land after harvesting the produce, so then this one must plow as well. All the farming of the land shall be conducted in accordance with regional custom. Just as the halacha, right, the Torah law, is that the owner of the field and the one cultivating it divide the produce, so too the halacha is that they divide the stubble and the straw. In other words, if there's a percentage relationship, that's how they divide the stubble and the straw. And just as the halacha is that the owner of the field and the one cultivating it divide the wine, so too the halacha is that they divide the branches pruned from the vines and the poles. And the two of them, i.e. the landowner and the one cultivating the field, both supply the poles. That concludes Mishnah number 1. Now the Gemara, and we are on page 103b. It was taught in a baraisa in a location where those cultivating the land were accustomed to cut the produce. The one cultivating this field is not permitted to uproot it. And in a location where the regional custom is that they uproot the produce, he is not permitted to cut it. Cutting versus uprooting. And the two of them, i.e. the owner and the one cultivating the field, can each prevent the other from deviating from the custom. Meaning they can agree to deviate from the custom, but if either one objects to this deviation from the regional custom, then they have to stick with the regional custom. The Gemara explains the baraisa. In a location where those cultivating the land were accustomed to cut the produce, the one cultivating this field is not permitted to uproot the produce, even if he wants to, Because this one, i.e. the owner who wants the produce, who wants the produce to be cut, can say, I want my land to be fertilized with stubble, i.e. the remains of the plants. And if the owner wants him to uproot the produce, that one, i.e. the one cultivating the field, can say, I cannot uproot the produce since that is too labor intensive. And similarly, if the custom is to uproot the produce, the one cultivating this field is not permitted to cut it, even if he wants to, because the other one, the owner who wants the produce uprooted, can say, I want my land to be cleared of stubble. And if the owner wants him to cut the produce, and that one, i.e. the one cultivating the field, can say, I want to uproot what remains so that I can use the stubble. So the Brisa teaches, and the two of them, i.e. the owner and the one cultivating the field, can each prevent the other one from deviating from the custom. And the Gemara asks, why do I need this statement and what is its purpose? So the Gemara answers that the Brisa is saying, what is the reason for this ruling? What is the reason that in a location where those cultivating the land were accustomed to cut the produce, the one cultivating this field is not permitted to uproot the produce, and in a location where they were accustomed to uproot, he is not permitted to cut? What is the reason? It is because the two of them can each prevent the other from deviating from the custom, as each has a justified reason for opposing the deviation from local custom desired by the other party. And the Mishnah teaches, if they were accustomed to plow the land after harvesting the produce, so this cultivator must plow as well. And the Gemara asks, well, isn't it obvious that he cannot deviate from the custom? And the Gemara answers, no, it's not obvious. It was necessary to say this for the situation of a place where the custom is not to weed the fields, and the one cultivating this field went and weeded anyway. Lest you say that he could say to the landowner, when I weeded the field, I did so with the intention of not plowing it subsequently. Therefore, he should not be obligated to plow it. And to counter this, the Mishnah teaches us that the renter should have specified this intention explicitly to the landowner beforehand in order to exempt him from the requirement to plow. Once again, they could have agreed to deviate from the custom if they did so at the outset. They didn't, so now they have an agreement in place based on regional custom, and the parties cannot deviate from it, and if they do, they incur liability. The Mishnah teaches, all farming of the land shall be conducted in accordance with regional custom. And the Gemara asks, what is added by the use of the term all? Why didn't it just say, farming of the land shall be conducted in accordance with regional custom? What does the word all add to this? The Gemara answers, it serves to add that which the sages taught. In a location where landowners were accustomed to rent out the trees in a field together with the land, so that the one cultivating the field receives a share of the fruits despite not needing to care for the trees are presumed to be rented out. But in a location where landowners were not accustomed to rent out the trees in a field together with the land, and the one cultivating the field does not receive a share of the fruits, so the trees are not presumed to be rented out, or are presumed not to be rented out. So the Brisa teaches, in a location where landowners were accustomed to rent out the trees in a field together with the land, so that the one cultivating the field receives a share of the fruit despite not needing to care for the trees are presumed to be rented out. And the Gemara says, isn't this obvious? And the Gemara answers, no, it's not obvious. And it was necessary to state this ruling in order to include the case where everyone in that region gives land to sharecroppers to cultivate in return for 1/3 of the yield, and he, the landowner, went and gave it for 1/4. So lest you say that the landowner can now say to him, this concession on my part, that I reduced my portion of the yield for you, was done with the intention that I would not give you a share of the fruits of the trees in the field. So the Brisa teaches us that the landowner should have said so at the outset, and he didn't, so now it's too late to make such a claim. Brisa teaches, in a location where landowners were not accustomed to rent out the trees in a field together with the land, and the one cultivating the field does not receive a share of the fruits, so the trees are presumed not to be rented out. And the Gemara asks, isn't this obvious? No, it's not obvious. It was necessary to state this ruling in order to include the case where all the cultivators in the region receive land in return for giving 1/4 of the yield to the owner, and this cultivator went and received the land in return for giving 1/3 of the yield to the owner. Unless you say that the cultivator can now say to the landowner, this concession on my part that I added to your portion above that which is normal in this region, I did that with the intention that you would also give me a share of the fruit from the trees. The Brisa teaches us that the cultivator should have specified this, should have said so at the outset. He didn't, and now it's too late to make that claim. The Mishnah teaches, just as the halacha, the law, that the owner of the field and the one cultivating it divide the produce, so too the law is that they divide the stubble and the straw. So Rav Yosef said with regard to this statement, in Babylonia, those who enter into such arrangements are accustomed not to give stubble to the sharecropper. The Gemara asks, what is the practical difference resulting from the assertion that this is the practice in Babylonia? Bava. So the Gemara answers, the difference is that if there is a person in Bava who gives the sharecropper the stubble in addition to the produce, it is considered merely as though he has a generous disposition, but we do not learn from his actions that this is the general practice. I am almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Rav Yosef says, the first, second, and third elements of the earthen barrier surrounding the field and the poles used to support a thorn fence are the responsibility of the owner of the land. But the fashioning of the thorn fence itself is the responsibility of the sharecropper. And the Gemara explains the principle of the matter is that the main part of the boundary of the field is the responsibility of the owner of the land, while any added protection that might be required is the responsibility of the sharecropper. Rav Yosef says the hoe and the shovel and the bucket and the irrigation device must be provided by the owner of the land, while the sharecropper must make the irrigation channels. The Mishnah teaches, just as the law is that the owner of the field and the one cultivating it divide the wine, so too the law is that they divide the branches pruned from the vines and the poles. And the Gemara asks, what is the purpose of the poles used for the vines? And they said in the school of Rabbi Yanai, this is referring to the long poles that were divided in half with which they support the vines in a vineyard. And the Mishnah teaches, and the two of them, i.e. the landowner and the one cultivating the field, both supply the poles. And the Gemara asks, why do I need the Mishnah to state this? And the Gemara answers that the Mishnah is saying that the Mishnah is saying what the reason is for its ruling. What is the reason that the two of them divide the poles? It is because the two of them supply the poles. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1, here in chapter 9. We're at the bottom of page 103b, and with God's help, we will continue on Friday. Today's Erev Shavuos. Tonight begins the holiday of Shavuos, or Shavuot, depending how you pronounce it. The commemoration of the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. What are we up to now? 3,300 and... I'm not sure, 37, 38 years ago, but over 3,300 years ago, God appeared at Mount Sinai and gave the Torah into the world. So we commemorate this with an all-night learning in most synagogues tonight, and then festive meals tonight, tomorrow, and Thursday. So we're going to have no class Wednesday and Thursday, and then we'll resume at the regular Friday time, which is the same as this special time today of noon Pacific. Couple of questions. Bill. So hold on. Let me be sure I've gotten the idea right. Day the rent is due. The landlord says to the tenant, pay up. The rent is due. Tenant says, what are you on? I paid you this morning. Have I got that right? Right, so we were splitting the hairs there. Like what we were saying was that after the rent is due, we assume that people are honest and the renter is assumed to have paid. So if the landlord says, you didn't pay me when it was due, the landlord would have to prove. Now, he can't prove that the renter didn't pay, but he would have to swear the oath. If the case comes before the rent is due, there's a presumption that the renter didn't pay, right? And why should he pay? He could say, well, no, I haven't paid, and I don't have to take an oath because it's not due yet. On the day that it's due, I suppose that's where the landlord says, you haven't paid me. The renter says, I paid you this morning. And now I guess the renter would have to swear the oath that he paid this morning because we're on that bubble. Tom, can the lender ask for it to be returned? If the borrower breaks it, must he repair or replace it? I guess we're talking about those cases, right, where he said it's a loan forever as long as it is in good working condition. I mean, it's sort of strange. Like, who makes such a loan? I mean, who makes such a loan? A father might make such a loan to his adult son, right? Because he wants his son to have what he needs. I don't know why he doesn't just give him the shovel, but he's saying, okay, it's yours, for as long as you need it. But the words they were used, you can have it as long as it's in good working order. So then the borrower has a right to it. And what's interesting is that even if he brings it back, let's say the owner needs it, then the borrower can say, okay, you used it? Good. I'm taking it back because you lent it to me forever. And that's as long as it doesn't break. If it breaks, he has to bring back the pieces, and then the rental period is over. And then the interesting codicil of that is that a kinyan is required, right? At least according to one of the opinions, that if you are going to actually say it's forever or as long as in good working condition, then you have to make a kinyan on that, right? Which would be presumably a witnessed act of a formal act of acquisition. So Tom's saying, can the lender ask for it to be returned? No, right? He can't, because he gave it for that, for forever. What he can ask to use it, and then he's actually going to have to borrow it from the guy who's borrowing it from him. And it's because the lender agreed to that forever period. And he shouldn't. Now, they could say, hey, listen, I didn't mean to lend it to you forever. Let's agree that it's not forever. And if the borrower wants to maintain a good reputation in the town, I would say he should agree to that. If the borrower breaks it, must he repair or replace it? Excellent question. Presumably, if he uses it in the ordinary course of business, the ordinary use, no, right? But if he uses it for some unordinary use, then yes, he has to replace it. But if it's stolen or lost, then he has to replace it. And if it's, so those cover the cases. So that's what I've got for us today. Wishing you all a beautiful Chag Sameach, a joyful holiday. Kabbalas Torah besimcha uvepanimius, right? Uvepanimius, so that you should receive the Torah with joy and, spiritual meaning. All the best, my holy brothers and sisters.